In the Mediterranean Sea, there is a group of remote lands whose inhabitants have evolved in isolation from the rest of the planet. Four islands, 1,000 stories, unique fauna, a world apart. The Balearic Islands. Where the animals and plants have assumed shapes and developed patterns of behaviour quite unlike any other in the world. And where we can still find distinctive living fossils of ancient flora and fauna that are mostly extinct elsewhere. These are the islands that Charles Darwin would have liked to have known. December the 27th, 1831. The Beagle, after a long wait, sailed out of port. This was the start of a long, dangerous journey, but one that would prove to be an unforgettable adventure. Charles Darwin was the naturalist in charge of collecting specimens and writing an exhaustive diary of all the natural and geological discoveries made on the trip. This voyage was the spark that led to the discovery of the mechanism responsible for all the biodiversity on our planet. A mechanism presented as the theory of evolution, which was in itself a scientific revolution. And thanks to that journey, Darwin was the one who unmasked the mystery, even though his conclusions clashed with his religious beliefs. The entire story of this documentary revolves around a very intriguing question. What would have happened if Charles Darwin, instead of sailing to the Galapagos Islands, had found himself on the Balearic Islands? So let's embark on an imaginary and fascinating journey through some isolated lands where we will discover the island's past and present fauna, which makes this archipelago a world apart. And from time to time, we'll see the similarities and differences between the Balearic and the Galapagos Islands. To see the Balearic Islands at a similar phase of evolution to the Galapagos Islands that Darwin encountered, we would have to go back in time to the reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Pepi II, around 4,500 years ago. Those Balearic Islands had been isolated from the continents for the previous 5 million years, and they certainly would have made an impact on Darwin and awoken in him the inspiration that he found in the Pacific Ocean. To reach those islands, he wouldn't have had to cross the Atlantic, but simply to sail towards the Strait of Gibraltar. And once he had crossed the strait, the Mediterranean Sea would have opened up before his eyes. In those times, the sea was bubbling with life. Cetaceans of all kinds and white sharks looking for monk seals were very common daily sights. In the coastal waters, hundreds of sea turtles may have arrived on the beaches of these islands to lay their eggs in the early summer nights. those were very different times. In the absence of humans, these islands' coasts offered abundant food and shelter to their inhabitants. The abundance of underwater fauna in the past was due to a single plant, a marine plant with roots, flowers and fruit. Posidonia oceanica, the main producer of oxygen in the Mediterranean. Curiously, this plant that had previously lived on dry land now formed one of the marine environments that provided shelter for much of the underwater life in the Balearics, as it had done in another time gone by, when it was found in the Tethys Ocean. Millions of years ago, as the Earth's supercontinent Pangaea was breaking apart. On dry land, however, the story had been quite different. The island of Ibiza, the ancient Big Pitusic, is the first of the islands that Darwin would have seen on this imaginary journey to the Balearics. This island measured 600 square kilometers, and yet not a single land mammal called it home, something unique throughout the pre-human Mediterranean period. On the other hand, Darwin would have found a land full of birds of all sizes and colors, like water rails, which today are so elusive and hard to spot, but which back then were almost certainly more trusting outside of their grassy havens. Or geese, which were probably unable to fly, but grazed on the large expanses of grasses of the time. There was an all-terrain lizard, and a few bats. But the number of bird species and the size of their populations were spectacular. In short, an extravagant island with immense herds of geese. But if he'd wanted to find big changes, Darwin would have had to inspect the fossil records that date back some 5 million years, when these lands began to isolate themselves in the middle of the sea. Fossils tell us that in the past, mammals did in fact live on Ibiza and Formentera, among them hares and the garden dormouse. There was also a species of lizard, and even a large tortoise, like the ones that live on the Galapagos Islands today. This truly stunning fauna was never seen by any human on these islands. Minorca, an island similar in size to Ibiza, had very different and singular flora and fauna back then. On dry land, Darwin would have found only a small lizard that was slightly different from the one on Ibiza and Formentera, a large dormouse, a shrew, and a small endemic goat called Myotragus balearicus, whose gait was rather comical when it walked. They were strange goats, sturdy, short-legged, slow, with low and bulky bodies, and not very good jumpers. They walked as if on stilts, and their eyes looked forward like our human eyes, while their sharp teeth, which must have cut like knives, gave them a mouth rather like that of a rat. Their bones, however, grew in a similar way to reptiles' bones. So this animal was pretty odd, unique in the world, and it lived on Minorca until the first humans arrived on the island about 4,500 years ago. On this island, a ringing sound could also be heard at night, a metallic clanging that was quite mysterious in those times. At the same time, the fossil remains on Minorca tell us that 5 million years ago, it was also home to a giant rabbit called Neuralagus rex, which could weigh over 20 kilos, about the same size as the little goat Myotragus. No rabbit like that has been found anywhere else on the planet. It disappeared some 2 million years ago. But where did that odd goat come from? Another ancient inhabitant of Minorca was a large tortoise, similar to the one on Ibiza. The unique inhabitants of ancient Minorca also included several birds, like Camusia quintanae, a crane exclusive to the island. The giant barn owl called Tito balearica, and the ancestor of today's shearwaters, Porphinus nestori, among other species. But today, all of them are extinct. Mallorca, 70 kilometers from Ibiza and 5 times its size, was populated by unique flora and fauna that was completely different from those of Ibiza, but practically identical to those of the neighbouring island of Minorca, the northernmost of the Balearics, just 40 kilometers away. When Darwin reached the Big Island, he would have found the same fauna, enormous herds of the endemic goat, and the same metallic ringing at night. And, according to the fossil remains from 5 million years ago, even richer endemic fauna, with several different species of mice, a giant viper, dormice, shrews, and naturally the sheep that was the ancestor of Myotragus. So we now know where Myotragus lived before reaching Minorca. Mallorca's flatlands at that time would have consisted entirely of thorny scrubland, full of junipers and boxwood, a poisonous plant that only the little goat with rat teeth could eat. If we look at the fauna of the Balearic Islands past, with species like the tortoise, the rabbit, the goat, even the Ibiza goose, we can observe that they developed according to a certain pattern of shape and size, a pattern called convergent evolution. And it seems that this was the best strategy to survive on these islands. That is, they were all herbivores weighing about 30 kilograms, with short extremities, and well adapted to the tough weather conditions in an environment with no terrestrial predators. What happened to all this now extinct fauna, especially the Ibizan mammals, is still unknown. We do know, however, that they became extinct during the toughest glacial periods, some 100,000 years ago. And we also know that a few species managed to adapt to all the changes brought on by humans, some small but mighty survivors. But what if Charles Darwin had really arrived on the Balearic Islands on the same day as he made landfall on the Galapagos Islands? That is, on September the 15th, 1835. Well, he would have had an easy time sighting sperm whales and rorquals, and even the occasional humpback whale. Smaller cetaceans would also have been present. It wasn't unusual to sail with dozens of pilot whales and different species of dolphins, such as the bottlenose dolphin, common dolphin, striped dolphin, and Risso's dolphin. They all still live around the Balearic Islands, where they feed and reproduce, but in much smaller numbers today. So the Balearics that Darwin would have found would have been very similar to today's islands, with a few exceptions, among which we should underscore the large marine predators. Different species of shark, such as basking sharks, blue sharks and white sharks, were very numerous along the Balearic coasts 2 centuries ago. Today, a few individuals appear now and then, but very rarely. And the presence of white sharks back then was due to another mammal that still inhabited the beaches of all the Balearic Islands in prolific numbers in the 19th century. The Mediterranean monk seal. These seals disappeared from the Balearics about 50 or 60 years ago. They fed primarily on fish, and that dependence on fish was precisely the reason for their decline. The predominance of the fishing industry in coastal areas compelled the monk seals to learn how to eat fish out of the nets, biting off pieces here and there. And so they became the target of angry fishermen, and became engaged in a battle that the seals ultimately lost, eventually becoming extinct on the islands. That's quite different from how similar animals in the Galapagos Islands are treated today, and from how Darwin found them. In the Galapagos, where humans don't bother them, people are allowed to move among the seals, and have spots that are set up exclusively for them to occupy. And humans and seals even share the swimming areas on the beaches. In the Balearic Islands, the last monk seals with pups were shot in the 1950s. But at this point in the 21st century, Charles Darwin would have found a long list of animals on dry land in the Balearics. Over the 4,000 years of human presence on the islands, some of these animals had been brought expressly for man's benefit, others were accidental travelling companions, and some were unwanted stowaways. And he would have seen that each island has its own blend of species, with different nuances and elements. Today on the Pitusic Islands, the famous English naturalist could enjoy watching shearwaters, although it must be said they've suffered heavily from human activity. But they're still common. At sea, not far from the coast, he would have seen groups of these pelagic birds that fish during the day and then wait for the darkest night to return to their roost and feed their young. These birds will even fly to the coasts of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula to catch fish for their young. Before, shearwaters could build their nests under any large stone or in a hole. Now, Darwin would only be able to find them on inaccessible coastal cliffs, where the rats, hedgehogs, cats and genets can't reach them. The only major land predator that Charles Darwin would be able to spot today on Ibiza is the genet. Besides an insectivorous predator, the North African hedgehog. These predators arrived in the 12th century, brought by the North African peoples who conquered the islands. Like the North African hedgehog, genets were used to fight the prolific plagues of small rodents, a job that cats performed as well. The landscapes of Ibiza feature scattered forested areas that make up the genet's natural habitat. But the island also offers other settings, like wetlands. One of the most notable is Las Faixas, a place which offers shelter to several kinds of Balearic wildlife. Another important wetland on Ibiza is the Salinas, or salt flats, which hug the sea. Here it's easy to see birds like flamingos, as well as other long-legged birds and waders. Darwin would also see that the entire coastal area is home to colonies of seabirds, among them Audouin's gull. This gull was on the verge of extinction in the 20th century, but today raises chicks each year in the Balearic Islands. So, the English naturalist wouldn't find any of the terrestrial fauna of long ago, except, that is, for the Ibiza wall lizard, which for the past 5 million years has inhabited every corner of Ibiza and most of the coastal islets, and still does. Just as on Formentera, where another subspecies inhabits the north of the island. Neighbouring Mallorca boasts high, rocky mountains that cover the entire northern part of the island. The Sierra de Tramuntana emerges from the sea with vertical cliffs that soar more than 1,000 meters into the sky. If he had visited Mallorca, Darwin would have found an island without lizards in 1835. There, the lizards would have been isolated on coastal islets, as is the case in neighbouring Minorca. Nor would he have found a trace of the rat goat. He would, however, have found large herds of goats with big horns, brought to the islands by the first human inhabitants some 4,500 years ago, running wild in various parts of the Sierra. What he would have heard is that metallic ringing at night in springtime. The mystery continued, but only in the wildest parts of the Sierra. That metallic sound was an enigma until about 40 years ago. We're referring to the ferret, or Mallorcan midwife toad, another secretive survivor that we can find only in the highest reaches of the Balearic Islands. But Darwin, if he had observed the little amphibian, would have jumped ahead many years, as scientists discovered its fossil before finding the first living specimen in the 1980s. Although, curiously, the inhabitants of the Sierra already had a name for this singular toad: ferret. With no fossil record older than 4 million years ago, it seems that the only way the ferret could have arrived on the islands was by crossing the sea. On the shores of eastern Andalusia, a group of toads may have been sitting on a tree trunk that was swept away, perhaps by a big storm, and so went on an involuntary voyage to the Balearics, coming ashore on Mallorca and perhaps on Minorca too, at a time when the two islands were still joined together. Another possibility could be that it walked there when the Mediterranean was a dry sea about 5 million years ago. In any case, on its arrival it found islands full of opportunities, safe havens and food. And most importantly, there were no predators. Apparently, a peaceful paradise for all eternity. Today, however, the Mallorcan midwife toad, called the ferret, lives well protected in this unique spot in the Balearic Islands. And Darwin would certainly have marvelled at this amphibian now found only on Mallorca, in the middle of the Mediterranean. If today the ferret is in danger of extinction in the Balearics, the guilty party is the viperine water snake, which came to the island from southern France around the 1st century BC, before the Romans arrived. And if Darwin explored these islands today, his attention would certainly also be drawn to this little bird that seems as nervous and restless as the explorer himself, the Balearic warbler. Endemic to this territory, in late winter it lays claim to its own space to receive its mate. But this warbler does not breed on the island of Minorca. Like the Balearic spotted flycatcher, it spends the winter in Africa and is only found on the islands during the warm months. Recent research has shown that the Balearic spotted flycatcher belongs to a species that is also found in Corsica, Sardinia and on the Italian coast, and that it is different from the continental species. It appears that the flycatchers remained on the islands during the glacial periods, and then, with the rising temperatures, expanded to the European continent, where they evolved into the spotted flycatcher. Today, Darwin would also enjoy the majestic silhouette of the cinereous vulture flying over the forests and peaks of the Sierra de Tramontana, where it feeds on the remains of dead goats and sheep. 180 years ago, their population must have been larger than now. Nevertheless, today close to 200 individuals delight both visitors and residents. Another large bird is the osprey. These birds could show the experienced naturalist how they feed on fish. To see them flying on windy days against the background of the sea is truly spectacular, a breathtaking experience. And if Darwin the explorer wanted to probe the most inaccessible hidden corners of the Sierra, he could discover which ponds Eleonora's falcons still come to each day to drink fresh water and rid their feathers of parasites. They're very close, by the way, to where they nest, on the islet of La Dragonera, which gets its name from the endemic lizards that inhabit it. On this very islet, it's possible to enjoy the sight of the largest population of this bird, which is called the Eleonora's falcon, or Falco Eleonorae, in honor of Eleanor of Arborea, Queen of Sardinia, who in the late 14th century established the first known laws to protect birds of prey. But there are also differences in the wetlands that Charles Darwin would spot sooner or later. For example, in the largest thicket of canes in the Balearics, which are found on Mallorca, lives the little moustached warbler. The largest population of this bird in Europe, and very likely in the world, is right here on this island. As one can imagine, they built their nests very well hidden among the canes. What we didn't know, however, is that they may be the only birds able to move over the surface of the water so that they can move around when looking for their mother to cry for food. The purple gallinule also lives here. This bird went extinct in the Balearics in the 20th century, but has been reintroduced successfully. Today we can see them in many wetlands in the archipelago. Other wetlands that Darwin would find are the open water areas like the salt ponds, or some areas of La Albufera, the coastal lagoon where wading birds such as these stilts have to seduce the females in order to be able to mate. Unsurprisingly, the ritual beforehand is a little sophisticated and has to be performed with all the art that maturity and experience bring. Avocets share the same spaces, although that doesn't mean that they're welcome neighbours. Darwin would certainly have been able to witness the fights that take place over space, because both birds are pretty grouchy, and when the arguing starts, the little ones understand that it's a good idea to get out of the way. As for invertebrates, many on Majorca are unlike any others in the world. For example, the Thorectes balearicus, the Balearic beetle, which in the past made use of the excrement of the endemic goat as food, and which today continues to feed in the same way, but from the wild goats or the sheep that graze in the fields of the Big Island. But Majorca, with its mountainous landscapes, has different climatic conditions from those of the other islands in the archipelago. Ranging from a dry, warm climate in the low flatlands to a colder climate in the Sierra, where snow usually covers the landscape in winter. And inevitably, some plants have adapted and become endemic, like the everlasting, whose local species is unique in the world. A little over 180 years ago on Minorca, Darwin would have found large populations of rabbits, rats, and mice. The Romans, in an attempt to rid themselves of these pests, decided to introduce some predators to the island. And so today, we find pine martens and least weasels with adapted forms and behaviour, as occurs with many other species on the Balearic Islands. Darwin would no doubt have immediately posed this question: how could an animal like the pine marten have reached this bountiful territory in the Mediterranean that is so ill-suited for the species? The answer is that as it was the first major predator to arrive on Majorca and Minorca, it had no competition, and so adapted quickly to the conditions of the islands. This is what is called the founder effect, and it's why today the Minorcan pine marten has become an endemic subspecies, and the largest in the world. As for the least weasels, which are smaller and more active in the daytime, they seem to have caused the extinction of the lizards on the Big Islands, since the Balearics had no land predators and the trusting lizards hadn't developed defensive strategies. as still occurs today with most of the fauna on the Galapagos Islands. So the new inhabitants introduced to exterminate the plagues of rodents became potential predators of the lizards. They were such easy and available prey that they ended up going extinct on the larger islands. Because of the rise in sea level at the end of the glaciations, bits of separate land took in a small population of Balearic wall lizards. And today, as happened on the Galapagos Islands, evolution has led to the development of differentiated subspecies on each islet, despite the fact that they emerged from the same single species. Some have even maintained extraordinary forms of behaviour that have amazed many naturalists and been studied by scientists. Darwin would certainly have been fascinated by these lizards that have an extremely singular relationship with a plant called the dead horse arum lily. The lizards catch the flies that this plant attracts thanks to the strong smell of rotting meat that it deliberately gives off. These lizards climb into the funnel of the plant to catch the flies, and weeks later, a fruit grows inside the funnel that the lizards eat, after which they spread the seeds throughout the islet with their excrement. The same thing happened in the Galapagos Islands with the emergence of the whole series of Darwin's finches that occupied all the available habitats while descending from a single bird species that colonized these islands in the Pacific Ocean. Who knows if Darwin would have reached similar conclusions about how isolated animals evolved differently from original animals had he observed these little lizards. If so, he could have published his work, The Origin of the Species, based on examples from the Balearic Islands. But Minorca, just like the rest of the Balearic Islands, has inhabitants that come on their own from very far away in search of the right place to live, like the bee-eaters, which arrive from sub-Saharan Africa every April to mate. Here, the bee-eaters, in addition to building their nests in slopes of earth or in the sand, also often make them on flat soil, or almost flat, by digging with their feet. To build their nests, they prop themselves up on 3 points with their 2 wings and their beak, so that their feet are free to dig. In olden times, the hoopoe also used to migrate from Africa to nest in the Balearics. But the island's mild winters made it possible for hoopers that stayed in the archipelago to live better than their migrating cousins and have more offspring. And so now, they live here all year round. Today, a stable population of hoopers is well settled on the islands. Similarly, at some point, perhaps thousands of years ago, the Egyptian vulture stopped migrating from Africa and also established a stable population on Minorca. In Africa, it's common to see them break ostrich eggs in order to eat them. But they had to abandon that behaviour on Minorca, of course, as there are no ostriches on the island. Some research footage on genetic memory, which filmed what happened when ostrich eggs were placed near Egyptian vultures on Minorca, showed that the island's vultures still remembered what they had to do to be able to eat them: pick up stones to break them. Some of the invertebrates that Darwin would find today are also endemisms that became isolated on the islands. Like this Pond's slug, found only on Minorca. It stays well hidden during the day under the rocks of the shadiest ravines. Although slugs may seem slow animals that have nothing to do but graze on grasses at night, here we can see their aggressive mating ritual, in which they expose their sexual organs and use their tails to reject those suitors that try to grab them from behind. More than an attempt to mate, it looks like a brawl. Another case would be this Balearic saddle bush cricket. It has tiny wings that don't enable it to fly. But then it hasn't needed to fly for many millions of years, because it stayed to live on Minorca and Majorca forever, and doesn't need wings to migrate to other places, as some grasshoppers do. All these invertebrates have many predators. However, there is one nocturnal predator that is especially fierce. With the aid of its hearing and sense of smell, it is able to find prey in the vegetation at night. We're talking about shrews. As we have seen, these shrews do not belong to a prehistoric species. The prehistoric shrews all became extinct on the islands. But new species arrived along with humans, so today Darwin could find these tiny yet efficient predators on the larger Balearic Islands. Then there are specialist predators, like the false smooth snake, which arrived on Minorca and Majorca from Tunisia in the 2nd century BC. A few centuries later, the lizards on the two islands disappeared from the fossil records. Another reptile that is abundant today, especially on Minorca, is Hermann's tortoise. This was introduced from Sicily. The males show the females just how strong they are by trying to lift them up and almost turning them over, or by chasing them wherever they go. This is their mating ritual prior to copulation, with noises that almost sound human. Certain plants also became extinct, but many adapted and are now endemic to the Balearic Islands, like the Balearic bastard saffron, which is endemic to Majorca and Minorca. It blooms in autumn and winter, and we can find it both in the forests and near the sea. Or the summer snowflake, a Tyrrhenian endemism that can also be found in Corsica and Sardinia. This plant has beautiful white flowers with green spots and is typically found in ravines and wetlands. On the other hand, if Darwin could have dived into the waters around these islands, he would indeed have found differences between the Balearic and Galapagos Islands, where the abundance of fish is amazing and exuberant. Nowadays, in the Balearic Islands, fishes whose populations have been decimated, such as wrasses, brown meagres and groupers among others, live in the safety of the seagrass Posidonia, which they are closely associated with. Even some species that are more typically found in sandy environments, like stingrays, soar like birds as they move over the undulating leaves, stirred by the effects of the currents or the waves. The reason for this is that, unlike the sand or the rocks, Posidonia provides them with a three-dimensional haven where they can hide from predators and find food. And so, huge populations of mollusks and crustaceans live and reproduce in these lungs of the Mediterranean Sea. But there are other environments besides the Posidonia fields. Many sea slugs or nudibranchs graze on the rocky sea bottom or in caves. And others, like the jellyfish, stay suspended in the water and are barely able to move through it, as they are very slow swimmers. There are also cephalopods in the coastal waters. It's not hard to find cuttlefish, which, despite appearing to favour living in sandy environments, are quite often found in the fields of Posidonia or among the rocks. Which is precisely where divers usually find octopuses, a cephalopod that is very curious by nature. Nevertheless, visitors to the Balearic's underwater seascape enjoy a spectacle of colours, environments and different fishes, with increasingly reduced populations, but which still amaze us with their presence. From the time humans arrived on the islands to modern days, the few animals from the pre-human period that have survived have managed to do so because they've been able to coexist with the species that man introduced. Only these heroes of the pre-human terrestrial fauna remain: the two wall lizards, today still found on Ibiza and Formentera, and confined to the coastal islets of Mallorca and Minorca. And the little midwife toad, the ferret, that took refuge in the Sierra. Like a piece in the fascinating biogeographic puzzle that science is beginning to reveal to us in the Balearic Islands, we know that the combination of rats, weasels and snakes contributed to the extinction of the lizards on Mallorca and Minorca. Later, the midwife toad became extinct on Minorca, and only its refuge in the Sierra de Tramuntana on Mallorca prevented its extinction in the Balearics as a whole. We also know that under Arab rule, European pond turtles arrived in Mallorca and Minorca, and the genet was introduced on Ibiza and Mallorca. It's likely that the prior introduction and naturalization of the pine marten on Minorca prevented the genet from establishing a stable population on that island. But today, all of them are present on these islands. During the 18th century, with the migratory movements of the Balearic population to North Africa, especially Algeria, the arrival of two African reptile species is observed. The Moroccan rock lizard on Minorca and the Morocco tortoise on Mallorca from Oran. And we could think the same thing of the tiniest animals, like the Argentine ant, which has colonized all of Europe, and is also present on the islands, cleaning and feeding on the organic waste of varied origin, while at the same time negatively affecting the native ant species. Thanks to the constant advances in our knowledge of natural history, especially regarding this archipelago, we have been able to make an imaginary journey to some islands that were quite unique, like the Galapagos Islands that Darwin found, the islands that allowed him to propose the theory that explained the origin of all the species on our planet. In this case, our journey took us through the Balearic Islands, a handful of islands occupied and developed by humans, islands which, despite the impact of some 5,000 years of human civilization, are still full of virgin wildlife that is sometimes hidden, forms of life that have made and still make this archipelago a separate and different world. The islands that Charles Darwin would have liked to have known.